the biography of of the panelists here. I'm supposed to introduce them, but somebody stole my biography sheet, so I'll just say that we've got three very distinguished panelists, and I don't know which ones. I know their names. I don't know which one of you wants to go first. You going first? Okay. The first one will be Eddie Jarawolo, who is the Executive Director of the National Youth Movement for Transparent Elections. Are you next, Randolph? Randolph will be second. L. Randolph Carter heads the Children and Youth Division of the Search for Common Ground and is co-chair of the Washington Network on Children and Armed Conflict. And where are you?
That's a good question.
Mark Summers, Associate Professor of Humanitarian Studies at Fletcher. And it's good to have them here. Let me just say that I have been twice in Liberia in my career, once in the 60s and once in the 90s. And speaking of transition, that was a transition from pretty good to just awful. Now we're on the transition on the other side, up the hill again. And I think we're going to hear about that, and it's very interesting to me because I haven't had the opportunity to be back in Liberia since I left 9 years ago. And I regret that because I've heard an awful lot about what's going on there. And I'm interested in learning from these gentlemen more, and particularly about what youth has done. In a sense, you might say that this is the specific panel after the general panel we've just heard about youth activities. And when I was in Liberia from 1995 to 1998, I was telling Randolph, unfortunately, most of the youth I remember were carrying guns. And I'm sure there were a lot of people like him around, but they were not as visible and not even as active as I think they are now, if what I infer from what I read here is anywhere close to accurate. I think that many of them may have been off in refugee camps because there were thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of Liberian refugees across the border in either Sierra Leone or Cote d'Ivoire. And but they were not, except during the 1997 election, not very visible. Now, speaking of the 1997 election, I was there for that. The U.S. government had a role in financing it and the technical aspects of it. It was, to say the least, a pretty bad election, but not from the point of view of cheating. Charles Taylor didn't need to cheat. He had everybody frightened to death anyway, so they voted for him because he promised the Liberian public that if he didn't get elected president, he would restart the war and keep it going. And if there was ever a good excuse for having a bad election, I guess that was it. And he was elected overwhelmingly. By the way, a little self-advertisement. I was asked 3 or 4 years ago to write an article about the hazards of political finance in Liberia. This was in what they call post-conflict societies, and Liberia was a post-conflict society. This was written before the 2005 election. It was written about the 1997 election. If you're interested, I'm not giving this away, but it is published in a volume called Political Finance in Post-Conflict Societies by the Center for Transitional and Post-Conflict Governance and by USAID. And they didn't manage to publish it for about a couple years after it was written, but anybody who wants to write that down can come up and see me after the meeting. In any case, that's enough from me. Let me start with Eddie. And Eddie, we're going to give each of you 15 minutes, after which I start getting very nervous.
Good afternoon. I'm very grateful to be here. I want to extend my appreciation to the organizer, NDR and Western Center. I also honor to have in present the program our staff at NED, my very good friends. Roughly 16 months ago, the Democratic War watched with great respect as the people of Liberia, a West African nation, that have undergone political suppression for almost a period of its statehood since independence in 1847. Also in a new democratically elected government headed by Africa's first female president, Madam Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. This gain was made possible through the contribution of over 64.6% of youth registered voters, or the 1.3 million. Through massive civic education campaigns throughout the country and sustained advocacy for reasonable representation of women and youth, provision for special conditions for old people, disabled, and analysis of the political party platform of Kennedy, the National Youth Movement for Transparent Election, stimulated citizen interest in the political process and raised their consciousness about the importance of voting wisely. After many decades of misrule in Liberia, intensified 14 years of killing and political corruption, in which more Liberians, including youth, suffer immense physical and psychological setback, economic disempowerment, increased neglect, the National Youth Movement for Transparent Election, which ourselves led the campaign to bring about a change to increase and inform participation of young people in the development and governing processes. NEMO Civic Education Campaign effort started in 2001, which with a campaign to sensitize students and youth and all citizens on the importance of their constitutional right to vote and vote wisely. NEMO initiated a number of surveys that informed the election intervention. One of those surveys revealed a strong yearning for Liberians to change the system. As combatant posts to engage in violence, weak and divisive political structure, very minimum political interest by women and youth, how doubt about what the Election Commission ability to administer the process in a transparent, free, fair manner. And overriding belief among the youth public that the election could be largely ceremony because some external forces with deep-rooted interests could manipulate the system, irrespective of how the people voted. Also taking into account 1997 election, 1,000 young people adopted the slogan, "You came on power, you came on man, I will vote for you." And indeed, overwhelmingly voted for Warlord Charles Taylor as president. It was quite vivid, again, how vulnerable youth were and the degree to which they could be induced by politicians with money and other material to win votes. NEMO therefore launched a campaign in Monrovia and rural Liberia, sensitizing citizens, particularly youth, to elect competent and credible individuals who could create a political space for women and youth participation and empowerment, genuine reconciliation, sustainable peace and development, transparent justice under the rule of law, and all of desirable outcomes. NEMO part initiated a number of activities well in advance of the general presidential election. NEMO enlisted a full involvement, interest, and support of young people through programs that tap to their political empowerment to their votes. The campaign made it a point to ensure that they understood clearly the battle had the feature that they have absolute control to positively shape the future by making wise choices. NEMO was informed by its funding of various surveys that citizens, including youth, have decided to stay out of the electoral process because they imagine that participation make no difference, since those elections could not be free, fair, and because there was no surety that those who elected then could do any different. To avert this threat of low participation, NEMO designed various strategies to counter the parent voter apathy, adopting a public education campaign approach which utilized outreach to youth in various parts of the country. NEMO quickly built consensus among young people by emphasizing that the election presented a very large chance for Liberia to redeem the country from which have required embarrassing a war or failed state. This campaign took the slogan, there is a large chance. Throughout the campaign, NEMO recruited and thereafter trained youth volunteers, deployed them as civic educators in the respective schools in town, and intensified our campaign. Most of these civic educators were our school youth, ex-combatant, disabled, and students. This initiative to recruit youth as civic educators gave ownership to the campaign and in general increased youth participation in the electoral process. They led a campaign called Get Out the Vote in Moserado, Bond County, near my Grand Bassa County. Get Out the Vote campaign, which includes visiting homes, street, coffee shop, school, community, villages, transport buses, educating students about the electoral process, where to register to vote, how to register to vote, when to register to vote, etc., etc. And they also encourage could-be voters to vote wisely and peacefully. This impacted the political process greatly and contributed to the peaceful conduct of the Liberian first democratic election. Similarly, to heighten the awareness on critical issues, including the need of a level playing field, NEMO again adopted a direct engagement, issuing press statements or press releases and granted interviews on local radio stations, and the benefit of recalling all candidates a fair chance to participate in the process, so that the bearing of, so that it can give of good support and a bear of legality to the process. We cautioned potential contestants, many of whom were former law incumbents in the interim government, who had looted resources, to avoid using government resources for their personal campaign. As such, I was in violation of the electoral law and contrary to the principle of competitive, free, fair, and democratic election. During the 2005 election campaign, NEMO also organized and conducted debates to create platform for youth to access and scrutinize various candidates on the basis of informing their discretion to decide and vote. They try and emphasize our lead campaign, No Choose and Vote. These engagements build consensus among young people to focus on the issue and the nonviolence. There have been increased democratic openness as the elected officials in the 2005 election, both in the executive and legislative branches of government, have taken office under the Constitution. There's much greater adherence to the democratic tenets than ever in Liberia. NEMO organized youth network in Europe and working to various programs in Bassa, Liberian, and Bond County. These youth networks are organizing and holding the elected officials accountable on campaign premises through community meetings, town hall meetings, and outreach. With support from the National Democratic Institute, the National Committee for Election Monitoring, a coalition of which NEMO was part of, recruited, trained, and deployed 500 domestic election monitors who lend local ownership and foster citizen interest and participation in electoral processes by helping to deter fraud reports private to electoral body for prompt corrective action and encourage peaceful conduct across the country. Announcing domestic election monitoring initiative, follow ascertain the credibility of the process and resort to the election by observing the entire process from the voter registration to tabulation and announcing a result. With youth increased interest in the political process is evident by the fact that they constituted an overwhelming majority of the registered voters. All of a total number of 1.3 million registered voters, 54.6% were youth, an unprecedented accomplishment in Liberia on checkered history of electioneering. Remember also that Liberian youth 25 years below were first-time voters. Lesson learned from these elections are numerous and varied, and they remain a significant inspiration to explore our continued involvement with youth. We have come to realize that youth can be mobilized easily when they are aware of the issue, engaged, involved in program planning and implementation. And when those issues are tied to their needs, they are even more likely to stay involved when they understand their interest, growth, and empowerment depend on the positive and constructive participation. We are also realized that through sports, social, civic event, and entertainment are effective tools of mobilizing youth. Nowadays, entertainment stands as the most prominent. Coffee shop and sports also prove to be very useful method reaching young people. Notwithstanding the fact that youth will warmly participate in the 2005 election, signal their readiness to remain engaged in the governing process in adequate sources of information, resource, and skill necessary to facilitate such continued engagement remain to be fundamental concern. We also realize that more young people who participated in student politics are likely to succeed at the national level. NEMO post-election program has helped bridge the information gap through young people active participation in the government, through public education campaigns, civic forums, youth leadership debates, schools and community forums. We assist the youth develop the confidence to endure in public debates, spreading their knowledge and understanding of government structure and function, as well as their role and responsibility. Prompted their regular interaction with policymakers, government officials, including legislatures, in classrooms, school campuses, and at community level. Successful effort of youth engagement can be further supported through conferences and training, where such experiences can be shared and learned. Direct program support that enable programmatic activity expansion to all our countries, documentation, publication, exchange and networking among young people, and all activity. In closing, I want to express my sincere hope that this conference on youth and politics, conflict content, will afford us the opportunity to explore new ideas and draw from unique experience of one another as we endeavor to promote democracy worldwide, greater involvement of young people in the political process. I look forward for a more fruitful deliberation and interaction. Thank you.
Thank you, Eddie. Next, we'll hear from Randolph Carter of the Search for Common Ground, an organization which I know very well and am very fond of.
I always traditionally have problems with technology, so hopefully this one will cooperate.
It's over there, Randall.
I guess it decided to go further away from me, as far away as possible. I'm also going to try to stay within my 15 minutes because I definitely don't want the ambassador to get nervous.
You'll know if I do. I'll start to fidget.
Sure.
Randolph, technologically challenged speakers usually get a few extra minutes.
Thank you very much. That was very generous of you. I'm not going to talk specifically about Search for Common Ground's program. I'm going to talk more generally about youth impact on Liberia's transition, but in terms, and I'm going to frame it around the Liberia National Youth Policy, which in my opinion is one of the biggest and boldest steps in Liberian history for youth activism and engagement politically as well as socially. You see the wonderful red, white, and blue, they're flying. I'm Liberian and I'm extremely proud of my country, and I'm even more excited because nowadays when you talk about Liberia, the first question that people ask you is not, oh yeah, you were the ones at war, but they talk about our leadership and they talk about some of the developments that are happening in Liberia, and I'm extremely proud of that. I'm going to set a brief context for you. Traditionally, Liberia is a country of two cultures. And this might surprise some people, but it might be very obvious for some people. Two cultures in the sense that there were Aborigines on the space that is now called Liberia when the freed slaves from the United States and the West Indies migrated to West Africa. Essentially what has happened is Liberia is now this country that has urban areas, quote unquote, but areas that are more westernized. And then there are areas that are heavily embedded within local culture and local tradition. So some of the things that I say will 100% apply to either urban areas, or some of what I say will have no bearings on the local culture. And I think that framework is what people need to think about once they engage Liberia, because you can make a statement and say education is the best thing or the thing that Liberians need, and that might work for Monrovia and Kakata and Banga, but when you go to places like Dia and Tieni, which I'm sure nobody here have heard about, that might not necessarily be what's essential to living and moving forward. So it's just good to kind of keep what I say in mind might not apply to everybody in Liberia, although the country is very small. The other thing about Liberia is that children are always children. So once somebody has changed your diapers before, that essentially means that you will always be a child. So you never grow up. And that kind of sets the context for how participation and youth engagement in politics is kind of like beating tradition. And this other point would tell you that when adults talk, children are not allowed to even be around. So children cannot participate. Children or youth cannot participate in adult conversation. So that sets the premise for showing you how much Liberia has moved, especially when we talk about youth engagement and youth's impact on the transition. One of the other crucial things that I need to kind of set as a prefix is the gavel of authority, or the power figures. Traditionally, power was held by elders. They're the ones who are the decision makers. They're essentially the courts. They're the ones who can divide land or take away land or give land. They're the ones who can restore somebody back to society or to community. So the power structure traditionally lied within the hands of the elders. Well, during the series of wars within Liberia, there was a shift, a real big and abrupt shift in that power structure. 7, 8, 9-year-olds now had AK-47s and RPGs and could make older people, or traditionally elders, do what they wanted. So there was a shift in power. There now is a post-war power structure. Well, there now is the development of a post-war power structure, which essentially is it's a tussle between, do we go back to the old ways and put elders back on the top, or do we incorporate a system where elders are seen for the values that they bring, but young people are resourced also for their innate skills and abilities? So Liberia is going through a transition where there is now this conflict of, do we restore old ways, do we shift back to youth being in control, or do we find common ground, if I can say that? Youth political involvement in Liberia has come a long way. Pre-1990s, and just to give you a little context, the war in Liberia officially started December 24th, 1989, when Charles Taylor invaded, was it Butua? Butua, way north of the country, and gradually made his way down to the capital, Monrovia. But prior to 1990, when the war officially started, youth political engagement in Liberia essentially centered around the University of Liberia Student Union, or in somewhat the Federation of Liberian Youth. You did not have youth mobilization around politics outside of those two groups, and you have very little youth mobilization around other social things except primarily football, or what Americans and others call soccer. But other than that, there wasn't any structure. And so most of the quote-unquote trouble that happened politically and that had to do with youth, I can almost guarantee you that if you watch the news or look in the newspaper, the University of Liberia Student Union will be written somewhere alongside the quote-unquote trouble. So that was the primary engagement of youth politically. 1990 and beyond have now created this this system and this culture, and the ambassador started to speak to it a little bit when he said when he was around, there wasn't a lot of this activism and engagement going on. But now, post-1990, there's been a proliferation of youth-based and youth-initiated organizations, and you see Eddie here is a prime example of a youth-initiated and a youth-based organization that's doing not only political stuff, but also that are serving as social actors for moving Liberia towards lasting peace and democracy. There is also, I must point out, political involvement around the 1997, and that should be, 2005, not 2006. But there is some action, youth political action around elections 1997, and Eddie here talked about them saying, you kill my mom, you kill my dad, but I'm still going to vote for you. 2006, there was also a shift in that where they didn't just say that, but youth came out in hundreds of thousands to support. Eddie gave a statistic that said 54% of those who participated in the national elections were youth. Now, that's a great percentage, but I need to give you a little, I need to pull the curtain a little and let you see what's behind that number. The 54% that participated were the ones who were eligible to register and vote. I can almost guarantee you that a large number or another huge percentage of young people who were at the campaign headquarters and were in the streets and demonstrating and marching and moving were not even eligible to vote. So you had this huge youth movement, especially around the 2006 elections, that in some instances was well-resourced, such as what Eddie and the rest did in using youth as election monitors. Search for Common Ground did some of those similar things, and other organizations did things around positively engaging youth in elections. There were mishaps where youth were incited to go ahead and not accept the election results and take to the streets and burn cars and all of that. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to try to talk within the framework of the Liberian National Youth Policy. The Liberian National Youth Policy is the first time in the history of Liberia, and in my short-lived life, that Liberian young people have been fully engaged at the policy level. Remember what I said earlier, adult conversations were not for children. And in Liberia, we don't really say youth, we say children. So even when you're 20-something, you're still a child. So adult conversations were, traditionally not for children. And so this youth policy, the development and the processes leading to it was the first time that Liberian youth had been fully engaged at the policy level. Another great thing about the Liberian National Youth Policy is the fact that it was decentralized. So it wasn't all young people from Monrovia who were sitting in Monrovia and creating a national policy for the entire country. They made a straight and determined effort to bring in the voices of youth from all parts of the country. So from Butuo to Zwedru to Rabasport to Banga, they brought all of these people together so that it's decentralized and that the voices of young people could be heard. I'll talk a little bit about some of the associated issues with that in a couple of my next slides. Another achievement of the National Youth Policy is that it cut across a breadth of issues. So it just didn't come up and make the broad statement that Liberian children, in order for Liberia to be better, the children need to be educated. It highlighted a number of the other issues that were needed to be brought to light in order for them to be fully included within society. And those issues included things such as gender. It included not only education, but also economic assistance. It included conflict resolution. It included self-esteem and the like. It was a great start, and it is actually a great start for youth engagement in Liberia. It shows the positive side of youth engagement, whereas, remember the statement my dear ambassador made that when he was there, that most of the young people he heard about or saw in the news media were all rebels. Well, it brings to light people like me and people like Eddie who were working undercover and who weren't in the media or who the media was not interested in reporting about. But it brings to light the long-term effects of what we were doing underground to show that youth can be resourced and youth can move political processes as well as rebuilding community processes forward. So the policy is a great start and is a wonderful document. There's a reason, there's an ulterior motive I have for underlining good document, and I hope I can show you that later. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things that I saw as challenges for the policy. I'm trying to make sure I stay on time here, Ambassador. The question was asked earlier, the question was asked to the earlier panel about how representative is being representative. And I think one of the challenges and one of the issues associated with the national policy is because traditionally it brought together young people who were, in Liberian terms, the elitists. I mean, they were the ones who at least could afford to go to school. They were the ones who were articulate and could stand up and talk and sound all important and all-knowing. And so even if they came from Zwedru, and even if they came from Rabasport and Gbanga, they were the ones in the good schools in Rabasport and Gbanga and Zwedru. What I think the policy lacked was true engagement with the children, with the young people who were in the villages and who were on the farms, who really didn't care about politics. Liberians are extremely political people. So if you listen to a Liberian young person talking politics, you would think that, yeah, that is our next president. Seriously, but there again, remember what I said about a country of different cultures. There is a whole other group of young people who could care less about that. As long as the weather was good and the birds didn't eat their rice and they had women, sorry women, but women to get married to, they could care less about stuff like that. And so one of the shortcomings was it did not include, it did not reach out adequately to that cohort of young people. Another challenge is the gender balance. I underlined the good in that good document. One of the reasons was because, yeah, in the document it will say, you know, we include women, and most of us do that. So we make sure to have a line there. You can't send something to a donor nowadays if it doesn't say something about gender. So yeah, there's something about gender included in there, but again, in the whole process, yeah, they made the effort to be as participatory as possible, including girls. But again, if you look at the statistics of those who were involved, and you look at the following steps and how the action plan trickles down, it goes from, yeah, gender to where are we talking about girls? And that, again, it lumps them up in action plans, specifically to be in this highly male-favorable initiative. One of the great things that they did, which I have here as a challenge, and I'll explain to you why I see it as a challenge, is that they narrowed the focus of the policy to start addressing, rather than saying these are all of the issues that we need to address, they say, okay, these are all of the issues that Liberian young people are facing. Well, let's start, given the resources we have, let's start addressing these issues. So they had the first thing, education, and I'm sure everybody in this room can guess the second thing, employment, and they had probably 4 or 5 things. And then in the let's not focus on this pile, they took out youth and conflict, or they took out youth conflict. And for me, that is a shortfall, because you cannot talk about education and you cannot talk about income and all of that if you don't address conflict. And this is why I say that. I was just telling the ambassador that I was in Liberia about 2 years ago, and I was working with some young people my age, and I asked them, what does it take to be successful in Liberia? And overwhelmingly, there were about 30 of them in the room. They all agreed that working for the government is what it takes to be successful. And I knew exactly where they were going with this. Now, this is before Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and her push for accountability. This is a government that was known for corruption, open and rampant corruption. And so working for the government was what they saw. And so I said, why? I'm Liberian, so I knew why. But I wanted to hear it from them. I said, so why? And they said, well, when you work for the government, and the ambassador can attest to this, you can drive a Mercedes-Benz, and you can own a big house, and you can have a generator. Now, My friend there was just talking about USAID's initiative to bring electricity to the country, but in the 1990s and early 2000s, people couldn't afford generators, so government officials and elites could afford it. My parents could not afford generators, so they had to stay in the dark. So for the young people, working for the government is the way to succeed. What I mean when I say they excluded conflict, and they should have included it, because conflict will address the whole issue of perspective. So if the perspective of Liberian children is that I have to work for the government in order to steal the country's money in order to be successful, then we need to address that. You can give them a job all day, every day. If they don't look at and address their perspectives, we will be going in a circle of corrupt governments that get toppled by another corrupt government, and the circle goes on. So I think the policy should have moved conflict issues and all of the subtopics that come under that to their focus. On the challenges, the government's response. I think that's one of the major challenges, because UNDP and the Wilson Center and NDI and Search for Common Ground, all these international organizations can do everything they want with something like the national policy. But if the government doesn't buy in, young people look at their government officials. And so if the government doesn't buy in to those and doesn't start doing action on most of those, the policies would move forward as smoothly as possible. Those were challenges. I went ahead and noted a couple of crucial pieces. I'm not going to spend a lot of time because I think I'm over my time now. If I can just borrow 2 minutes to close up.
Talk to the next speaker.
I love this group. But real quickly, I'm just going to run through some crucial pieces. I underline good document because a crucial piece to this is converting the great process of participation of youth and the great outcome of the document into action. And that's where the policy is now. The policy is stuck in the house. And it needs more than being stuck in the house, but movement. But movement in terms of action. There also needs to be the incorporation of multi-level action. So not only government in terms of the word government, but the various agencies, and the policy specifies several different government ministries that are crucial. So the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Youth and Sports, and obviously all of those play crucial roles in pushing and moving this policy forward. It also entails the inclusion of local as well as international NGOs, and more importantly, communities where these children live and thrive, or these young people live and thrive. There needs to be a lot of information dissemination around or regarding the national youth policy. A lot of young people don't know about it. In the big cities, yeah, they've heard about it, but the further away from these city centers you get, the less people know about it. This, for me, is a crucial piece in that we talk about the stabilization of power, and we also talk about youth empowerment. Most people preach and want, we need to put youth on the forefront. That cannot be done that way. It needs to be done with adult partnerships. So don't just say, young people, you're in the forefront. Go ahead, but walk with them, hand in hand, train them, equip them, and give them the capacity to do stuff, and don't just put them in the forefront. That's setting them up for failure. There needs to be a look at incremental accomplishments, meaning let's not sit down and wait for the Wilson Center or UNDP to give us money to move the policy forward. There are certain actions that can be taken on the policy that has nothing to do with resources. It has a lot to do with mobilization and coordination. Again, next steps, I see them revisiting the plan of action, focusing more on the non-money driven aspects of the policy in following up. So not sitting and waiting to get the money to do it, but focusing on what are those initiatives that Search for Common Ground or that UNDP can do within their mandate to move it forward. Moving beyond youth who participate only in political initiatives to go into, there are lots of other youth organizations. Bring them to the table and resource what they have and resource their accomplishment and achievements towards getting Liberia out of the transition. Initiate media awareness. Search for Common Ground has done a lot of this. I think we have the capacity to do it, and we're about to begin a miniature project with USAID, OVC Bureau to move some of the information, to disseminate information around the policy outside of the city centers to the towns and villages through our Talking Drum studio in Liberia. Definitely make deliberate attempts to move beyond the national and provincial capitals targeting youth in the villages. The policy is not the Liberian National Youth Policy if it only incorporates Monrovia and Banga and Kakata. It has to incorporate the breadth of the country. And I think last but not the least, this is where my good friends, the donors, come in, identifying the benefits that youth engagement bring to Liberia's transition, and then adequately supporting it. So Liberians don't expect donors to always put their hands in their pocket and give, but in order to change the mindset, start supporting them now, especially start supporting youth-led initiatives, and then let's move those forward. And then the more Liberians take on the responsibility, the less they expect of donors. Thank you so much for your time, Mark, and thank all of you for your time.
Thank you, Randolph. That was very good and very interesting. And, of course, as you know, we will cut off at 5:30 even if there are no Q's and A's. Mark Summers is our next speaker. Mark, you'll have to talk fast, but don't worry if you go a little bit past 5.
Okay. All right. Thank you. What I was asked to do was talk a little bit about the context of youth in conflict situations, and then use the case of Liberia to talk about a bit. And I wanted to also to build on some comments of all three of my colleagues here. One is to talk just a bit about the 1997 elections, and to talk about, I liked the way Eddie described most youth in Liberia as economically disempowered, which is, I think, a really powerful way of talking about most of the youth. And then Randolph talked about this conflict between youth in control or elders on the top that's going on. It's sort of working itself out in Liberia. I would add that it probably is working itself out in many places, not just Liberia. And one of the reasons has to do with how institutions like governments and international agencies are already at the wrong starting point to begin dealing with youth. Here's an example. Reintegration is what we talk about with dealing with youth. As Randolph is talking about, youth aren't interested in reintegration. It infers something going backwards, going back to the old. And as he so well described, that's not what they're interested in. Integration, it's the wrong term conceptually. That's what we want. That's what governments want. They want things to go back to the way it was before the war, and that will never happen. I haven't found a youth yet that has told me that in interviews. That the whole world has changed, and the situation of youth has changed, and it would be impossible to do anyway. I also wanted to make a reference. I just made some notes based on the starting point that we had from the first that came out of the first session, which I think what I drew from some of the comments was that it's often assumed that youth are a potentially violent group. And when we say youth and violence, we mean young men. And we mean young men in particularly with reference to sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East. Those are the two areas that security experts are primarily concerned about. It also expands out of there, but those are the main issues that's being inferred. And there was one comment that I'd like to call to your attention again, and it's this: youth frustration can lead to violence and conflict. Now, I've been doing research in this work on this issue for 18 years. And I have to say that this has rarely been the case. And that it's not that this isn't true, it's the context that is a bit distorted. And here's what I mean. Doing this kind of research, when you learn about the desperate situation that youth face in their current situations, you begin to realize that they're extraordinarily peaceful, patient, and resourceful people right now, without constructive engagement. And there's a disturbing, I think, and unfortunate emphasis on the violent potential of youth. And this shields, I think, the remarkable and overwhelmingly persistent presence of youth living peacefully and their extraordinary ability to resist involvement in violence. And it's this issue of resistance which is not looked at very much. Now, where do these ideas come from? Has anybody seen Blood Diamond? Yeah. All these people came up to me and they said, Mark, I've seen Blood Diamond. You've got to see it. It's just as you described it. And I was so, disappointed by what I've been saying about Sierra Leone after I saw it. Because it would give you the impression that every single young Sierra Leonean male was toting a machine gun and was high on drugs during the Civil War. Does anybody know how many youth were involved in on the rebel side during the war? Anybody at all? 20,000. 20,000 is the estimate. Does anybody know approximately how many youth there are in Sierra Leone? Something like 2 million, I'd say. Okay. We didn't get much information in that movie about the other 1,800,980,000. Just to point that out. So, in other words, even when youth are not constructively engaged, and most aren't, most have no chance of ever being in a program that anybody is going to fund from a donor. There's too many youth. Okay? So most of the time, nearly all of them remain peaceful. Now again, when you study this, when you talk to these people, it makes no sense. And yet they do it. Not all of them, but most of them. An overwhelming majority. I just wrote out some questions. One is, how have nearly all youth managed to remain peaceful under extremely stressful and frustrating conditions and without constructive engagement? Another would be, how are most youth able to resist engagement in violence? Another would be, at the same time, why does it take riots by youth, for example, in 2004 in Kosovo, the youth riots, in March of 2004, in Liberia, in October of 2004, to get some attention for youth concerns? In most situations, they have to riot to get attention. In most situations, they don't riot. But in the cases where they do, things happen. Okay? There was no funding for the National Youth Policy until after the riots in Liberia. And I should point out, because I got a tour of all the places that were destroyed, youth, when they're violent, are, for the most part, self-destructive. They burn down their own neighborhood, for crying out loud. And there are 7 neighborhoods, apparently, in Monrovia where these took place, not in the other areas, not at Mamba Point, where and other places where most people go, foreigners go. And then another question would be, why are we so afraid of male youth? And I think this is important because I think a lot of these ideas come from our own fears of what goes on with male youth. And I would really argue that we're probably not doing as well as we could be working with youth, in part because of our starting point, which again is negative without much evidence to support it. I am not saying that a lot of youth cannot necessarily lead to conflict, but even in those situations, 90-something percent of them, like in the case of Sierra Leone I outlined, don't get involved. Okay, so that's what I wrote during the last session. Okay, I wanted to point something out about these people that were raised earlier in the first session, and Randolph mentioned as well, the issue of the non-elites. This would be the overwhelming majority of youth in nearly all of the post-conflict countries that we're talking about. When I was in Liberia in early 2005, I was looking at a youth program that was funded by OTI and being carried out by Creative Associates. And I was hearing the usual, platitudes about how good the program is from youth participants and asking about who's not in the program. Of course, most youth weren't in the program. And there was after a while, I got to learn about what people were calling rebel youth and youth exhibiting what they called rebel behavior. So what are we talking about? Now, these are a lot of youth in these villages where I visited, and I visited a lot of villages. Well, they curse, They talk angry, they drink, they smoke, they ask for money, they ask for loans, and then they don't pay it back. They act rough. More significantly, and this is what elders talked about, when communities called on them to contribute to some communal labor, they wouldn't do it. Now, they're not supposed to do that. Okay, that's breaking with tradition. And they refused to participate in the training because they weren't getting paid. There was no per diem. Okay, so in talking about this with some elders in one of the villages about these rebels, because there's a lot of them, all right? They drink and they're smoking and they're out in the forest and so forth. They said, look, one elder told me, look, if you live here with these rebel behaviors, we will chase you away. You can't stay here with those rebel behaviors. Another added, what we want in the community is what they do for us. Now, it's no surprise that the overwhelming majority of youth are in Monrovia or are rebel youth. Okay, so what's going on here and how do we deal with this particular issue? Well, I think in order to understand youth today, and I think there's a lot of information on this, justifiably so, on the demographic context. We're living in the age of youth. There's more youth today in terms of sheer numbers and the proportion of youth in the overall population than there's ever been in human history. Something like 1.5 billion of humans are between the ages of 14 and 24. I don't have the stats in front of me. But 1.3 billion are in developing nations. While the West is getting older overall, the rest of the world is getting younger and younger and younger. So the demographic realities have a direct impact on what we're doing in post-war, trying to build post-war democracies. And it brings to mind two questions that we could consider. One is, when we speak of youth and democracy, or any other post-war endeavor, exactly which youth are we talking about? Now, this came up in the earlier session, and this is something also that Randolph talked about. Do our ideas include the rebel youth, for example? Do we know what that's all about? Do we know why they're resisting? Do we know why they're acting out? A second one is, where does democracy fit on the agenda of youth? Now, it's clear that it's important to us. How important it is, if there was a quote that in the previous session, that the most important thing to Nepali youth was a job, then why are we talking about elections? How is that connected to getting a job for youth? That's a theme that runs through a lot of discussions with youth in these situations. Some general points about youth in post-war situations, and I'll say very quickly, Ambassador, a couple of things about Liberia. But first, I just wanted to say that in general, excuse me? Okay. I'm doing fine? Okay. In general, populations are youth-dominated in the countries we're talking about, while government and agency policies, investments, and actions are not. Now, that's a fact. Government policies aren't youth-centered. The National Youth Policy is one of the most encouraging examples of a change in a positive direction, as Randolph talked about so well. That which exists for youth generally surfaces more from what institutions are prepared to do and less from what youth want to do. Let's go back to the example. We're talking about elections. Youth are talking about getting a job, for example. Okay, and there's a lot of should that's implicit in this program work, right? Youth should farm. I heard that a lot in Liberia. And not go to cities. Well, that's not working. But again, there's this attention, this tendency to focus in rural areas and these post-war areas. We want youth to go back and farm. We don't want them in cities. We don't even understand why they're there, quite often. Many youth should join public works programs. Well, they don't always work so well. And they don't always yield particularly satisfying results among the youth. And I should point out that most youth programs, I did a review of youth programming for Paul Sully and EDC and USAID a couple years ago, and found that most youth, we really had trouble finding, number one, evaluations of youth programs, and number two, evaluations of any quality. They were, most of them that said they were evaluations were not. They were more like describing what they did as opposed to evaluating the impact. Many post-war youth are misunderstood and deemed as threats, as I talked about earlier. And part of this perceived threat arises from the fact that wars tend to transform the social roles of youth. In addition to causing tremendous amounts of trauma and destruction in youth lives, war can also loosen the reins of society over youth and create a situation where youth are redefining their own roles in society, which is exactly what Randolph was talking about. Part of this youth reinvention is tied to urbanization. Urbanization tends to skyrocket during and after wars, and the urbanization is led by youth. Kigali, Pristina have approximately tripled since the end of the wars in those two countries. Monrovia, nobody even knows how many people are living in Monrovia. But it's something like 1 in 3. I don't even know. Does anybody know? Eddie, do you have any idea? What's that? Above 1 million out of 3.5 million people. So 1 in 3 maybe. And in these cities, youth live in something like parallel worlds with their own subcultures and communities. Many, if not most, youth have no intention of going back either to the confining cultural roles of the past or to their rural homes. Reintegration is the wrong term, as I said, and integration is what is sought on new terms that they'd like to define or be engaged with. And here's something that I'd like to emphasize. The impact of sexual violence in general is grossly underappreciated by governments and agencies in post-war situations. 3 in 4 Liberian female youth and women have been victims of sexual violence. 3 in 4. Female youth, of course, are disproportionately affected, and obviously this can impact participation levels of female youth in voting and other post-war initiatives. And you have to ask yourself a question. Does a victim of extreme sexual violence really want to be hanging out with a lot of men, particularly young men? Why would they do that? Why do we want youth programs that have equal amounts of female youth sitting alongside male youth if these young people, these young women have been so extensively and violently abused? Youth may be in civil society, but those involved tend to mainly represent elite male youth. It's a starting point. It's where we are. You have to start somewhere. Women's groups, in turn, tend to represent older women and much less female youth. And you find, in political terms, that the most underrepresented group are female youth. And the most at-risk group in a post-war society, in general, from my experience, are female youth. So stepping back, what you have here is a significant proportion of the nation's citizens, non-elite youth, that are not represented in civil society or the government, and worse, are tagged as the problem. As a result, what you find is a kind of tragic irony, which comes again out of this demography, where perhaps the majority of a population, that would be youth, see themselves as members of an outcast minority. That's a very, very challenging starting point to begin talking about democratization and inclusion. And it's dysfunctional. The Liberia case, quickly, the demographics are about as astounding as any country I have ever read about. There are an estimated 4.4% of all Liberians that are not children and not youth. So what are we talking about in terms of the representation of the government for the population when the median age of the entire population is 18? And I would argue, probably, if you took a profile of the most typical person in Liberia, it's an 18-year-old girl or young woman. To talk quickly about 3 contextual points about what we're talking about here. Ambassador Milam described already the '97 elections. I would like to point out that 90% of registered voters participated. In October 2004, there were youth riots in Monrovia. And there were various reasons why it took place, but it is undisputed, I think, that male ex-combatant youth were at the center of the looting. And they were extremely frustrated. I interviewed them after that, and they talked a lot about promises that weren't kept, in their view, by the international community and by the government. And then you have the 2005 elections, where the most popular youth candidate won the first round, George Weah, and lost in the runoff. So, of course, given the history of Liberia, there were some suspicions by some youth that it wasn't fair. Of these three events, which has proven to be the most influential for the youth situation? Well, it appears that the answer is the October riots of 2004. That got everybody's attention and seems to have awakened the leadership that they'd better get going and do something about youth, or they're going to burn the rest of Monrovia down, right? Reportedly, that's when the National Youth Policy finally got some funding to get it going and to do all this remarkable progress that Randolph talked about. There was also a youth training program that came out of USAID that started to work with ex-combatant youth in those 7 neighborhoods in Monrovia where the rioting took place. And that happened fast. That was quite an impressive response. So if we return to our questions, when we speak of youth and democracy or any other post-war endeavor, which youth are we talking about? Usually it's educated male youth. Where does democracy fit on the agenda of youth? We probably don't know because members of the non-elite majority are not often heard from. But my guess is that it probably wouldn't be elections unless it's connected to improving their lot. Here's a third question. Are the voices of a nation's core constituency? In most post-war nations, given the demographics, it's lower-class, undereducated youth. Are they being heard? Are their needs being addressed? Is the post-war government truly representative of the majority of its population? Well, in most cases, the answer is, my sense is, not yet. But that's our starting point. I mean, you have to accept, okay, where are we now? It seems to me that's where we are. And to begin working with this marginalized youth majority, again, the economically disempowered, I think we need to ask ourselves honestly how we're going to deal with this new and unusual challenge, because most governments and international agencies don't have the background to do this. And a starting point is to realize that you don't have it, and then to figure out how to move forward from there. And I think there are 3 keys. One is gender, one is class, and the third is location. We're likely not talking to enough of the right people in the youth population in order to get a sense of youth realities and to properly respond to them. Working with elite youth and many others is risky, and let me explain this. The tendency is to begin working with youth, and any youth can do because they're youth, right? We've been talking mainly just about youth as a category, when it's 50% of a population. So what are we talking about? Well, if you focus on the youth that are reasonably well-adjusted, okay, they probably will respond to your program better than ones that are less well-adjusted and a little bit suspicious or alienated. But you might run the risk of having a successful program and actually causing negative impacts, because the alienated youth, which is the majority, will say, you see, it's those same people, they get everything. The ones with education, those men, whatever it is. And you can actually, this we know happens with DDR programs, when youth who resisted involvement in combat get mad because all the funding and all the assistance, in their view, it's not always the case, goes to ex-combatant youth. And so the National Youth Policy is an incredibly important first step. But I think what was needed is to reshape governments and international agency approaches to be youth-centered. If you look at the demographics, and most people in our country are youth, then if we want to work really on representative government and to be responsive to the majority, then that's what you have to aim for. It's going to be difficult, but that should be our goal, in my view. And I think we need to understand, to do this, the world where reinvention, resilience, alienation, and histories of extreme sexual violence rule the roost, and figure out ways not just to include these non-elite youth, but to feature them in the work of peace building, nation building, and reconstruction. They have youth groups too, and most are ready to be engaged. Thank you very much.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've had 3 very, very rich presentations, and if they ran a bit over,